Okay, we're live here today with Jordan Burke. Jordan has an interesting background. Formerly, he was a police officer, and since then, he's changed careers. He's really traded in his badge and gun for a Bible and a rosary. He's followed his heart, and he's focusing on bringing more attention to things that matter to him. He has a personal motto that is "Do the harder thing." So we'll talk about that, and especially we'll probably spend most of the show today talking about a new book that is out, released by the Sophia Institute. It's called "The Popes Exorcist: 101 Questions About Father Gabriele Amorth." This coincides with the release of the movie with Russel Crowe, which I have not seen, called "The Pope's Exorcist." So, Jordan, welcome to Finding Freedom.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Good to have you here. So let's start out with I think sort of an obvious place to start. You've had a pretty interesting career change and background. So you were a former police officer. So can you talk a little bit about how you got into and really what drove you, motivated you to become a police officer?
Oh, yeah. So motivation, that's an interesting question. I think looking back, I was really young and I was trying to get into the military. And it was one of those instances where even though all my paperwork was done and I was streamlined and it was, oh, yeah, you're going to go to MEPS and then you're going to go to, we got it all figured out. It was one of those things where God was like, nope, that's not happening. And he just closed the doors. So one thing after another, the doors got closed. I never ended up going into the military. And truthfully, this is kind of comical, but I don't even remember applying for the police department. I have a feeling it was probably just like, we'll apply for police. We'll apply for fire. I always had a sense of justice, like rightly ordered justice. And I think I had a bit of rose-colored glasses going in. At the time, I would say that I didn't. And to an extent, I didn't. But I became pretty disenfranchised isn't the word, but I burnt out pretty quick. There was a lot of stuff that was going on. I worked in one of the top 10 most dangerous cities in the nation. I think they still make the top 10 list. At least they did at the time. And I just kind of saw the writing on the walls.
What city can you share?
Birmingham.
What area?
Yeah, Birmingham, Alabama.
Okay.
Yeah, and I worked in project housing, so that added a little bit of fun to the scenario.
Mm-hmm.
But so I went in prior to Ferguson happening, and watching the world kind of shift and change. And then at the time, this was my formative years, and so I was still developing my personal worldview and seeing what was going on, both politically and how it affected policing as a whole and the people that we were supposed to be serving, interactions with people, and then kind of connecting the dots on a lot of different things. And then seeing Ferguson happen and how the world responded and all the things that were happening after that, I kind of read the writing on the walls, and I just discerned, if you can call it discerning, because I was a wreck at that time. But I basically just discerned this isn't the life for me. I have a little girl on the way, and I'm not going to have my daughter grow up without a father who was killed potentially for something that he didn't necessarily believe in. So I know that there's a lot there, and I don't want people thinking, I don't know. There's a lot there, but it was an interesting experience. And so, after that, go ahead. You have a question?
No, I was just going to say, there is a lot there. I've interviewed people who've come from, at least from a policing standpoint, left the police force for, I think, probably pretty similar reasons that you did. It's just, joining with good intentions, thinking that you're helping, and then once you're in the system and you understand it's very different once you get into it. So I think my audience definitely can really relate to that aspect of your story. So anyway, continue on.
That's exactly it. It was with the intention to actually serve people, and then being put into a position where, I was in there for a little over 6 years, I think is what it ended up being, because people thought I was crazy. Oh, in a few more years, you'll have your pension and all these other things. I was like, I can't. I can't do this.
Hmm.
So as you said, the system is corrupt in a lot of ways, and I just couldn't be a part of it any longer. And it was, I will say, I did make a pretty solid effort to try to change it. I was a field training officer when I left, which meant that anyone who graduated the academy would come to my car, and I'd give them practical application. Okay, this is what you learned in your textbooks, in your classes. This is how it's actually applied. Safety, and I made a serious effort to try to tell people, you need to understand that every action that you take has repercussion. And,
Hmm.
you may think you're doing something that's moral because it's a law, but that doesn't mean that it's moral or ethical. And you can destroy somebody's life if you're not, if you are not thinking for yourself, you can destroy somebody's life. So, after after trying to change the system as much as I could, and getting kind of, by my perception, blacklisted on a lot of different things, I was like, all right, I'm done, and I see where this is going. And of course, we know how the state of policing today, it was pretty much worse than what I could have predicted, but along the same lines of what I predicted. And I was like, I gotta do something else. So
Yeah. A little background on me. I used to host a podcast called Felony Friday,
Mm,
which focused almost entirely on the criminal justice system. And I talked to a lot of individuals who, really had their lives ruined, or
mm,
a family member had their lives ruined, and collateral damage,
yep.
impacted them through the broken system. So definitely understand where you're coming from there. So to pivot here, you leave the police force after about 6 years. You kind of mentioned before that your life was a wreck. Eventually you end up turning to the church. Was this sort of like what was the time frame there? How quickly did that occur?
Time. So you're asking someone who's severely chronologically challenged.
I
So
am too.
I'll do my best. But it was so I converted to Catholicism in high school, but it was very much an intellectual pursuit. My dad,
Hmm.
who had converted, and he was talking to me about it, and I thought, oh, that makes sense. Apostolic succession makes sense. I like these things. But it was never something that I made my own. So I was Catholic at the time that I was a police officer, but I throw up the air quotes because I certainly wasn't living it. And and because of what I experienced in the police force, both, not even really in terms of what I dealt with day to day, which does take its toll, but just trying to deal with the morality and ethical issues that I was coming against day to day, that combined with everything else was just too heavy. So that, and then as I mentioned, my personal life was a wreck. All that combination was like a perfect storm. So I had kind of a St. Paul moment, so to speak. So I left the police force. I think I was out for about a year, and I was installing granite countertops because I was just taking whatever job I can get.
Hmm.
and and I got brought into the Avila Institute, which my dad founded. And because of my video editing background and things like that, they needed that. And I thought, well, this is probably better than hauling, hundreds of pounds of granite on on these jobs. Don't mind the workout, but
Yeah.
I kind of shifted, and in that, it really pushed me in a lot of different ways because it was a completely different environment. And so a lot of things came to head. So the pushing on my faith, as well as my personal life, was really had been damaged in the process of my prior career, and then had never really recovered and continued to get worse. So ended up divorced, unfortunately. And it was like this, the only thing I can equate it to is a St. Paul moment, because I was completely I was knocked off my horse, I was blind, and I was, by the grace of God, rescued in a lot of different ways. And it was, gosh, I would say maybe another year, which is totally uncommon. And I don't want people hearing that and thinking like, oh, okay, there's always hope, right? But I
Hmm.
definitely know that my situation is very uncommon. It's not because I'm special. I think it's just that I was so broken that when you're that empty, you have a lot of room for grace, by the grace of God. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, it was kind of a chaotic time.
No, that I think that's sort of common, in a way, for it to happen that way. And I'm not Catholic, but I am a Christian,
Sure.
and I have had on a few people in the past to talk about, really, this battle between good and evil, and exorcism And especially, I think in these times that we're in today, that you can almost feel it in the world that something, something is shifting, in the spiritual battle. It's almost bubbling up to the surface. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on, because I think a lot of these things, I think in the past, at least, maybe it was just my perception as a younger person, but it was just stuff that you read about or heard about. But I think now it's sort of more applicable, at least to me, to the
No, I
things that are
agree.
going on in this world.
No, I totally
So
agree. Yeah.
yeah. So let's start out with who this individual is, um, Father Gabriele Amorth. Am I saying that
Yeah,
correctly?
that's right. That's right.
So he's referred to as the Pope's Exorcist. So tell us a little bit about who he is.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character. He was a priest. Well, I should back up. So I love his story for a lot of different reasons, because it kind of shows that, much kind of like my story, I think maybe why I'm interested in it, but it shows that God pulls people from wherever he wants to pull them from. And so he felt a call to the priesthood I believe when he was about 13 years old, but he didn't pursue it. So he ended up fighting with the resistance in World War II, and then later ended up engaged in politics to the point where he helped the Italian prime minister write their constitution at that time. And he didn't become a priest until he was in his 30s, but he didn't become an exorcist until he was in his 60s.
Wow.
Right. Right. And then he died in 2016, if memory serves. So from 60 something to 90 something, he performed all these different exorcisms. And during that time specifically is when he kind of garnered this fame, not by choice, but because the rate of the amount of exorcisms that he was doing and what he was learning and the impact that it had on his faith, he had this charism, so to speak, of sharing this information. And he wanted people to know. He wanted people to know, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is what we're dealing with. This is the reality. This is what the gospels say, and it's still being lived out today, and you need to be aware of it. And and from the point of an exorcist who's dealing with it really on the front lines, face to face, in a different way. You and I and those who are listening deal with it as well, obviously, but in a different way. In particular, it kind of gives us these guidelines. So yeah, so Pope's Exorcist comes primarily because he was the exorcist for the Vatican for a period of time.
Mm-hmm. And so you talked a little bit about the time frame from 60 to 90 years old, which is not really what you picture someone
Right.
doing that intense type of work, doing
Right.
these exorcisms. But he did it some astounding number. What's the number that he did?
Yeah, so
Over
by
the
his
time?
estimation, he performed upwards of 60,000 exorcisms. And to put that in context, because that's a wild number on its own, but to put that in context, it's not 60,000 individual exorcisms. It could be seeing one person upwards. I think he said
Mhm.
the most serious cases may take like 50 sessions or something like that. So it could be multiple sessions with one person, but regardless, like you said, from 60 something to 90 something, 60,000 sessions is mind boggling in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. So yeah, so when you want to talk about someone who has the experience, he's the guy.
I've heard that before in my past conversations, talking about exorcisms, where it can take, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50 sessions, which is very surprising to me.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe why that is in some cases?
Yeah, so when you study angelology and demonology, one of the distinctive things is we understand in the Gospels that there's a choir of angels, right? So there's particular levels of angels. When when angels fall and become demons, what we know as demons are just fallen angels. They maintain or they hold that same level that they had in heaven. It's just inverse in a way. So if
Mm.
someone was a part of, there's seven choirs, they're part of the fifth choir. When now as they're a demon, they have that same fifth choir. I hesitate to say skill or ability. It's kind of difficult to explain because it's not it's not necessarily skill or ability, but that level that comes with it of maybe
Mm.
power might be a better way to explain it.
Is it like a hierarchy of
Yes, yeah.
sort?
So the demons
Okay.
have their own hierarchy, and it's generally an inverse of whatever they had in heaven. prior to the fall. So I only mentioned that to mention that there are particular demons that have, let's just say, bigger claws than others. And when we're talking about exorcism, it's an act of removing the claw, so to speak, or removing the chain from the person who is being oppressed, or in case of exorcism, possessed. Oppression, is one level, but possession would actually determine a full rite exorcism. And so there's all these variables, from the various powers of the demons that they hold, to even what God permits, because we understand that everything is either willed or permitted by God. And which sounds crazy to some people. Why would God permit that someone be possessed? Well, there's things as suffering souls, so there are those people who are permitted to experience some sort of what we would call an injustice for the sake of a greater good, because they can handle that injustice, and because they have the ability to maintain in that suffering produces good graces for some other grander thing. So obviously this is like a fire hose of like random theology, right? but the basic understanding is that we can't just assume that someone can go into an exorcism and bam, they're done. Sometimes that is the case, and that's fantastic, and that would be great. That'd be perfect if every case was like that. Unfortunately, that just doesn't seem to be the way that it is. And the other variables are even maybe the demon, we know certain demons will hide behind certain things. Of course they lie. And so it may take multiple sessions just to determine how that demon, whatever the doorway was for it to enter. And once that doorway is found, then they can help remove the demon by closing that doorway. So again, I know that I've given you like a scattering of information, but that's kind of in the context of the conversation, there's a lot going on.
No, that's good, because I think there's a lot of directions to go there. But
Sure.
I'll start with the last thing you said. They're talking about a doorway to enter. So
Right.
when you talk about a doorway to enter, are you talking about like how the individual came to be in touch with that demon? Like, for example, using something like a Ouija board, or is
Sure.
it, am I way off?
No, you're dead on. So there's a couple different doorways. So Father McManus, who was involved with writing the new rite of exorcism, has talked about several of the doorways, and they can be anything from what you've mentioned, which was using a Ouija board. And I think it's important to mention too, for people, that not every Ouija board use results in possession. However, it's still not smart to play with fire, but there are cases where someone has used it and become possessed, right? So there's both of those realities exist. And then you have, wow, my mind just totally went blank. I apologize.
Talking about
Doorways. Yes,
doorways.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a day. We've had tornado warnings and watches. It's been a day. So
what part of the country are you in?
Alabama.
Okay,
Yeah, Montgomery,
that's right.
lower Montgomery, Alabama. We got hit pretty hard earlier today, so we've been running around. So with the doorways, though, you also have things like wounds, and that's one that a lot of people aren't aware of. And it's not so much that you are wounded emotionally or physically by someone and it's suddenly you're possessed. It's not how it works at all. It's more of a, as Father McManus explains, I equal my wound, right? So someone who is not seeking healing, someone who is we're better known as like the victim mentality, right? That can become a doorway. Well, why is that? Well, it's contrary to what God created you to be. God wants you to heal and be whole. And if you're living in your, to use a phrase, your spiritual diaper, right? If you're just sitting there and you want to be a victim, and I'm not, not being uncharitable towards those people, but that is kind of the reality of what's going on. If you don't want to snap out of it, that can be a doorway as well. So from wounds to Ouija boards to people actually seeking out to make contracts with demons, all these different ways can be particular doorways. And the most stunning one, I think, that I've read so far in all my study on this topic, he actually mentions in this book, is that at his time, the most common way, again, at his time, I don't know if this holds true today, but when at the time he was asked this question, they said, well, what's the most common way for people to be possessed? He said, well, in my experience, it's people being cursed. And that's a whole nother discussion. Right? It's like, well, hold on, wait a minute. So you're telling me that someone who did not seek out demons, who is not particularly wounded, who is not, playing with the Ouija boards, can be possessed? And his answer was yes. There is this reality that the demons can or are permitted to act in particular ways, and whether or not we can see the means of what's going to happen if it is permitted. Well, and we may not need to get into all of that, but that's one of the most common ways that he saw. So anyway, I don't want to ramble too much. So
No, it's what a podcast is for. It's
okay,
about
good.
going down a different rabbit holes. So I did want to circle back to one thing you
Sure.
mentioned there. You talked about contracts with demons, and I want to make sure I understand what's meant by this. Would an example of that be like, we always hear about, music artists who are, worshiping the devil, or movie stars who are worshiping the devil in exchange for, maybe not worshiping, maybe they've just, made a deal with the devil in some certain way in order to advance their career. Would that be an example of a contract with a demon?
That's exactly right. So yeah, that's exactly right. That's the most common thing that we hear about. I think, so don't sue me. Paul McCartney, I believe it was. There's a famous story about him making a contract with the demon, and he was told in such and such amount of years you're going to die. And sure enough, when that time came, he did die.
Well,
So I
Paul
believe
McCartney's still alive, so it would
okay.
be.
So it wasn't Paul McCartney then. Yeah, it would.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember who it was. I'd have to look it up. I apologize. I should have been more prepared for that one. But that's one of the examples. Another example is what you see a lot on the, let's say, TikTok, is big right now. You'll have these kids who want to, or who are getting involved with what they believe is witchcraft and these sorts of things. And so they want to access some power that they perceive that someone is selling to them. And so they seek to make an agreement or contract with some entity in order to receive that power. So would be another example of people making contracts.
So can you talk a little bit about, the number of exorcisms that, Father Gabriele Amorth did, and really, the many times repeated with the same individual. So what's that process? And we don't have to get too into detail, but you can, if it makes sense to, like, what's an example of the process or the tools being used, or, kind of where these meetings would typically take place? And I know that's a lot of different questions, but
no, it's fine. So the tools one is the easiest. We can knock that one out pretty quick. So the tools are just various sacramentals. So he'd always have his purple priestly stole, which is a sign of the priesthood, blessed or exorcised water, exorcised salt, a crucifix. These are kind of the common things that he carries. So these are, in the Catholic Church, these are considered sacramentals, and that they help with a particular sacramental grace. Another one that you'll hear commonly, Father Carlos Martins talks about this quite frequently, is relics. So in the Catholic Church, for those who are unaware, there we have relics of saints who the church considers saints. And what's fascinating is to hear about cases where, you'll come up against a particular demon, and let's just say that they are in charge of, or their specialty is probably a better way to say it, is impurity. Well, maybe there's a saint that specialty is chastity. And so having the relic of that saint has proven to be effective in many different cases, in helping, well, number one, annoy the demon, but in some cases, having them just go entirely. So all these different things in conjunction, right? So those are kind of the tools. In terms of the place, it's funny because in the book, he had written that he had to move around a couple of different times, because he'd go to a place, and the place in which he was holding the exorcisms, whoever, rented the space or whoever was around him complained, because there are times where people will get really loud, they'll scream. And he jokes about it because he was a very humorous man, but he said, we always had to have a place that was far from the street so people didn't call the cops, so they didn't think anyone was being murdered. So that's an aspect of it. Later on, so tools in place, and then process. The church has a really in-depth process from someone who believes that they're possessed to getting them to an exorcist, and that's for a couple of different reasons. Unfortunately, there are those who just pretend that they're possessed for the sake of whatever reason they want to. It doesn't really make any sense. They could legitimately be mentally ill, but there are stories of those who just wanted attention from somebody else, and so they're pretending to be possessed in order to get that attention. So it's important to determine whether or not the case is legitimate. And so to do that, let's say someone who's listening says, well, I think I'm possessed. You'd contact your local diocese. They would have you fill out this information. You generally go see a therapist. And that's also because if the person is experiencing some sort of legitimate mental illness, then the church doesn't want to say, well, you're not possessed, so we can't help you. It's okay, you're experiencing something. We don't think it's possession. It seems like a lot like it's this, whatever this mental illness is. Let's address this. And we'll help you address this and get you to see who you need to see and whatever treatment you need. And then if things are continuing, then we can go to the next step. But there are those who go through that process, and almost immediately the therapist is like, I don't understand what's going on here. This doesn't make any sense. I can't, logistically figure out, this doesn't fit in the DSM or whatever the case may be. I think that they need to go see the priest. And even then, the exorcist is going to have some tests to determine whether or not the person is actually possessed, because there are people who have made it through that entire process, who have fooled multiple people, who are still not possessed. So, and that's an interesting topic too that we can talk about at some point. But yeah, it's kind of the process.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. So, I mean, part of like when I think of exorcism, of course, it goes to, what you see in the movies and things like that. And I'm sure there probably are some exorcisms that are close to that. But I'm kind of assuming that there's some that are very, very different.
Oh yeah.
And, I know that, as human beings, we are tempted every day, and, there's the battle with the flesh. Not every encounter with that is a demon, but are there, examples of someone being, someone in need of an exorcism who really, if you saw them on the street, you saw them interacting, everything would seem, perfectly normal?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so to address your first question, Father Amorth, in another one of his books, wrote that, hey, you need to understand that not all of these are these crazy things where people are levitating and vomiting objects that they couldn't have eaten. He said a majority of them are just like a doctor or dentist visit. It's like, come in, we're going to do the prayers. You might twitch a little bit, with a little bit of humor, but you might twitch a little bit, but then you're on your way. Not all of them are these kind of grandiose things. But to your second question of, can someone just kind of appear totally normal? That is possible. So while this book I'm about to mention was kind of embellished a bit, the stories are true. So I don't know if you're familiar with Hostage to the Devil, Malachi Martin.
No.
Okay, so I wouldn't recommend it, only because
You would not recommend it?
I would not. It's a great book, but I'll say this. As a cop, I saw some of the most horrific things that you could potentially imagine, and experience some horrific things. And I have a very strong gut. And in this book, Hostage to the Devil, there's a couple stories in there that are things that I left and I was like, wow, I kind of wish I didn't read that. So that's why I don't necessarily recommend it. It's very, very dark. But one of the stories in there is about a priest who became possessed. And what's fascinating is because it shows that everyone can be a target, everyone can be a victim, for one, but then also that somebody who is in that position of authority, so to speak, can be possessed and still execute their tasks as a priest. This priest would still do mass, and he wouldn't be affected. Right. And that's kind of more of an extreme case, because there's levels of oppression within the possession that allow for someone to kind of exhibit or not exhibit the kind of demonic behavior. And there's some things that they can't avoid. But in the case of the priest, this is why I bring this up, is that he could appear completely normal, and people wouldn't really have an idea of what was going on. That being said, though, and this goes back to what you mentioned earlier about how kind of the darkness is becoming more real, and we're feeling in the world all these different things going on. I firmly believe that it seems with all these different cases that I've studied, at some point the enemy overplays his hand every time. And I think it comes down to pride. And I think it's just pushing and overplaying his hand because eventually something will come to the surface that reveals maybe not that they're possessed, but that something weird is going on. Which is what happened with this priest in the book. He ended up leaving the church, which and forming like some sort of cultish type thing, which is a pretty obvious sign at that point. But for everyone else, you know, it could be. Well, let me put it this way. And you touched on this as well: the daily temptations of the flesh, the daily temptations that we experience in the normative Christian life, right? The way that the enemy works is not just, it's not a, I'm going to go snatch that person, I'm going to go possess them. It is a progression. It is a, I don't know if you've seen Nefarious, but it was brilliantly done. And he says something so perfect. He says, not, or enough yeses and not enough nos is exactly what we need. So these little things of, okay, I'm not going to deny myself, or I'm going to go indulge in this, or I'm going to commit this sin. And maybe from stealing a toy to, you know, stealing something else to progressively getting worse and worse. In those yeses, you're giving consent to evil. That's what sin is, you know, regardless of religious affiliation. We all understand that's what sin is, right? So giving yes to that, giving consent to that evil is giving more power to that demon over you. And so eventually you can go down a path where, you know, you can either become fully possessed, or you just fall away enough and you're spiraling enough that it serves their purposes as well, because you're away from God and you're doing what your flesh desires versus what is actually virtuous.
You know, that's an interesting thing to think about, especially, you know, going back to what we're seeing in the world today. And I forget the name of the company, but a couple of years ago, there was a mainstream, you know, company that sold, I don't know, merchandise, purses, things like that for women. And, you know, they had some very evil satanic elements in a photo shoot that was kind of out there in plain view. Then you think of like what happened recently with Target, with their pride displays, but within those pride displays was merchandise that was being sold by a, you know, out Satanist, someone who was, you know, worshiping Satan. So by putting that out in place, and I hadn't thought about this till you said that, and if people know that, okay, I'm still going to buy that or shop there, or you know, buy through this website that is openly telling me it's satanic, then they then would be giving consent, right?
Yeah, in a way. I don't know if the levels of culpability in terms of shopping, but it's definitely something to consider, because we're, you know, in a way you can consider that a sin of omission. It's like you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You know, for me, when I saw that stuff go on with Target, I told my girlfriend, I was like, hey, stop. No, we're not giving them any more money, because in a way, in my conscience, I feel as if I would be culpable giving them money to further that, to continue. So it's really becoming more and more evident. You know, even going to we was just at Barnes and Noble the other day, and seeing all the tarot cards and all the Ouija boards and all the spell books and all these other different things in the self-help section. I'm like, what? Like, are you kidding me? And of course, it's always targeting kids. It's always targeting young adults and things of that nature. But yeah, it's becoming more and more obvious. And we have to be very careful about where we spend our time and our money.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I guess I'm just noticing stuff like that more because you become aware of it. But I was listening to an episode of Joe Rogan a week or so ago. And Joe Rogan, obviously, he's not a Christian. He's, you know, he's very open about that. I'm not sure where he falls, if he's agnostic or atheist, but you know, he's talked about his, you know, taking DMT and coming in contact with, you know, beings and that whole thing. So you would think he would understand, you know, there's some sort of other world there that is, you know, some aspect of evil. And if there's evil, there's got to be, you know, there's got to be good. But I don't know if he's thought it through that much. But he was talking about his daughter, and I don't really understand what this thing is that she was using, but some sort of device used to detect.
I heard this too.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
was like, holy, because he was talking about his comedy club. He's like, oh,
Yeah.
he's like, I can feel like an aura in the comedy club when I'm there, like it's supposed to be there. And he's like, and my daughter has this thing and she says it's haunted. And I'm just like thinking, what the heck are you doing
Right.
letting your 12-year-old daughter play around with like this other world? But I guess most people would hear that from me and think, what are you talking about? That's insane. But that's like where my mind goes right away.
Well, it's funny. You're not the only one because I thought the same thing. I remember that episode, and as soon as I heard that, I was like, "Oh, dude, like
Yeah.
you can't do that." I spoke about this on another show. I don't remember when, but I never wanted to get into this topic of study. I had no interest
Mhm.
in it because when I was younger, I was fascinated with the ghost hunter shows and all those other different things, and I went deep. And unfortunately, what it resulted in is I believe it opened some sort of a doorway because
Mm.
I had no negative experiences that I can recall until I was really diving deep into these things. And then next thing I know, and there are plenty of people out here who are going to say, well, it's probably just a psychological, you just tricked yourself psychologically. I don't believe that's the case because I never had a fear of anything that I was looking at, with the ghost hunter. I never had a fear. It was a fascination, right? But to the point where, we were in this house and hearing footsteps all over the place, so loud and clear that I thought someone was there, even when I was the only one there. Other different things like that that had no. I'm the most skeptical person you're going to meet, right? So I caveat that with this. I'm going to check everything. There's no reasonable experience or explanation for why I experience the things that I experience, and because of that, for whatever reason, probably the grace of God, I made the connection. Oh, dude, you're looking into this stuff. Like, what if you're opening a doorway to something? And so I cut it off, and it all ceased. I never had any issues after that. So I was like, I want
Wow.
nothing to do with it. So coming into this later, I was even more cautious when it became evident that this was what I was supposed to be working in and studying and producing content on. Um, and yeah, so I take all this very seriously, and that is one thing. These ghost hunter shows. This is a side. I'm going on a rabbit trail here, so I apologize. But the Catholic Church even has a stance on that, which is, most of it is probably fake. A lot of it is evidently fake, but there are such things as we count the souls in purgatory. And what if this is a soul in purgatory who's asking for help, or whatever the case may be, and going to these haunted houses or doing these other different goofy things is more mocking these souls potentially who are in need of help rather than actually helping them. So
Mhm.
I don't know, that again, that's another rabbit trail to go down, but yeah.
Well, it's either that or it's demons, right? I
Right,
mean,
right,
yeah,
exactly.
or it's
Yeah,
nothing, and someone's making a fool of you. So
right,
any of the
exactly.
options necessarily aren't good.
Right.
Um, but so I did want to ask. So I have two more questions. One about Father Amorth, and then one I want to come back to you. So Father Amorth had some views about the importance of exorcism within the Catholic Church. Can you talk a little bit about why he felt exorcisms were so important?
Yeah, reading all of his text, he never outright says it, but it becomes really evident when you take it all as a whole that he had a very serious heart for service. He had a very serious desire to help set people free. He saw people hurting. He saw people suffering, because we have to remember
Mhm.
that at the core of what's going on when someone goes into an exorcism, they are suffering. They're suffering.
Mhm.
They could be vitriolic, they could be spitting on you, but the reality is that they are suffering. And he saw that, and he had a real heart for that. So much so that he even created the IAE, which is the International Association for Exorcists, to help kind of spread this information. And that was a part of what he did within the church. Now, he had some interesting takes on the new rite of exorcism, but a lot of it, again, if you take it in context with all of his writings, it was a lot about the red tape. So he writes about how, well, the Orthodox, you can just go ring a bell and you're going to get an exorcist. Now, I don't know the efficacy of that experience. I don't know what that looks like. And to slide the scale to the other side, It's pretty well known. So Father Ripperger is one of the most well-known exorcists right now. He wrote a book called Dominion. And in that book, when he's talking about the different levels of demons and things like that, he said, there is a reality that there are some Protestants out there who have been able to free people from demons, not through their own merit, because even with the exorcists, it's never by their own merit, it's only through Jesus, but in particular because these lower level demons, they have no choice. It says in scripture, every knee shall bow, right? So by the very power of the name of Jesus, these people are set free. So it shows us there's this reality of, regardless of the religious affiliation, their power of Jesus it's there. So that's why I can't say the efficacy of, what the Orthodox does or what they do. But he knew within what he had within, the sacramentals that are given by the church and experiencing all these different things, that it was very important, and he wanted to help as many people as he could. And for goodness sakes, 60,000, he never gave, I think he said I could never count the individual cases, but for the sessions, you got to imagine 60,000 is tens of thousands of people probably that he helped, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, that's a lot of hours to put into 30 years of doing it. Pretty remarkable. So one more question for you. So I talked about in the intro that your personal motto is "Do the harder thing." Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So when, I mentioned my life was a wreck, and at that time, I don't know if you've ever had an experience where you're having an argument with somebody in your head that never happened, or that it may never happen. It's like a preemptive argument, which is yeah. So I was in the midst of my divorce, and I was just wrecked because I was doing everything I could to try to save the marriage and all these other different things. And so I'm having this argument in my head, and in the midst of the argument, I said to this person, "You need to just do the harder thing." And for whatever reason, it like snapped me out of this like hyper emotional experience. I was like, what does that even mean? And so I started, it just stuck with me. It was so, the story doesn't really give as much details as it should to explain how deeply it affected me, because I took it every single day to do, okay, what is the more difficult thing that I can do? Should I run the dishwasher, or should I just hand wash the dishes? I used to like to go get lost in the woods just to like think and pray. And anytime there was an opportunity to take a more difficult path, I would take that more difficult path. So it became this method of self-denial. So like this type of mortification in a way, but to really subjugate my flesh, so to speak, to the intellect and to the will. And then as I went on, it became a really good kind of test to figure out how I should handle certain situations. And theologically speaking, or just speaking as in the normative Christian life, what's more difficult, to be mad at somebody who has harmed you, or to forgive them? Well, you need to do the harder thing. You need to forgive them. Right. So it became this like all encompassing kind of method of living my life. And I turned that into a ministry, because at the time, one of my big issues was struggling with pornography. And I had met with some of the greatest minds, I believe anyway, of therapists in that area. And so I was able to take all the knowledge that they gave me to help me break free and condense it and apply different aspects of the church to really help other guys break free. So that carried on for some years. I called it "Do the Harder Thing," of course. And then after a couple of years, it was really evident that God was like, all right, cool. You did what I wanted you to do there. Awesome. Good job. Now I need you to do something else. And I'll tell you, I still have my Jonah moments, and that was a big one. It's like, I want nothing to do with what you're asking me to do, but I'm thankful to be where I'm at now. And it is very edifying to have these conversations. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's
it definitely does. And it kind of relates to something that, I've been thinking on, more recently, and I've just been hearing it more, I think, where, life is suffering, right? We're going to suffer. So you can either choose how you suffer, which really that's most of the time, I think it's going to be doing the harder thing, maybe in that moment. Right. But over time, it's going to make will make your life better, and you'll have less suffering from it. So I think that's great that's a great motto, to do the
Yeah.
harder thing. And
Well, and
and
you look at scripture, to your point. If we look at scripture, Jesus is very clear. He who does not pick up his cross and follow after me cannot be my disciple. It's like, well,
mhm.
ain't nothing easy about carrying the cross. So,
No.
yeah, so that's
Yeah.
it. It's doing the harder thing.
Well, that's awesome, Jordan. And this has been a great show, but we are out of time. So, lastly, if I could ask you just to give your plugs here for the book, and also for anything personally that you want to point people
Sure.
towards.
So, book is Popes Exorcist: 101 Questions about Father Gabriele Amorth. Sophia Institute Press is where you can find that. I work for spiritualdirection.com, avilainstitute.org. You can find all of my work and content on Instagram, because it's the most fruitful of all the evil social media platforms, unfortunately. And that's do the _ harder thing. You can find me there. And I think that should be it.
All right, Jordan, thanks for coming on
Awesome.
Finding Freedom.